There is a particular kind of silence that only exists in a room where something important used to happen. Not the silence of an empty field or a quiet street, not the absence of sound. Something denser than that. The silence of a place that remembers what it used to be, that holds the shape of what was once performed inside it, the way a glove holds the shape of the hand it was made for, even after the hand is gone. Nora Calloway would come to understand that silence better than she understood almost anything else in her life. But on the morning this story begins, she was sitting at the counter of a small diner on Main Street in Turners Falls, Massachusetts, eating a bowl of vegetable soup she had paid for with the last of her food money for the week. And she did not yet know that her life was about to change in a way she could never have planned for and would never fully be able to explain. She was 20 years old. She had a canvas messenger bag on the stool beside her, and inside that bag was everything she owned. A change of clothes worn soft from too many washings in too many different sinks. A small tin of watch oil, the label faded, the tin itself dented at one corner from being carried in a bag for 2 years. A set of 7 watchmaker screwdrivers in a leather roll that had been oiled and re-oiled until the leather was nearly black. A photograph of an old woman at a workbench taken in 1974. The woman's eye pressed to a loop, a pocket watch open on the bench mat in front of her, the lamplight catching the concentration in her face. And around Nora's neck on a cord of worn leather, the loop itself. Brass casing slightly tarnished the lens ground to a magnification that a watchmaker's eye needed and no other eye in the world particularly wanted. The soup was 79 cents above what she could reasonably afford. She had bought it anyway because it was cold outside, and she had been walking since early morning, and her feet were wet from a puddle she had misjudged on the sidewalk 2 blocks back, and she needed something warm inside her before she could think clearly about what came next. She did not know yet what came next. That was the truth of it, plain and without softening. She had been second her entire life, and now she was not even second. She was outside in the cold with a canvas bag and $10 in the loop her grandmother had worn around her own neck for 33 years. She wrapped both hands around the bowl and let the warmth travel up through her palms and thought about Ruth. Ruth Calloway had been a watch repair woman at a small jeweler's shop in Greenfield, Massachusetts for 33 years. She had started there in 1961 as a shop girl, at the age of 19 hired by the jeweler, a quiet man named Mr. Aldridge, to sweep the floors and answer the telephone and keep the display cases polished. Mr. Aldridge ran his shop the way certain men of his generation ran things, with patience and very little wasted motion. And he had the particular quality of attention that comes from spending a working life with small, precise objects. He noticed things other people did not notice. Within her first month, he had placed 3 watches on the glass counter and asked Ruth to identify the one that was running slow. Ruth had listened for 10 seconds and pointed to the correct watch without hesitation. Mr. Aldridge had looked at her over the top of his eyeglasses for a long moment. Then he said the sentence that would define the rest of her life. He said, "You have the ear. I have been looking for someone with the ear for 20 years. He taught her everything he knew. 4 years of evenings after the shop closed, the two of them at the repair bench with the rest of Greenfield going about its business outside the locked front door. Mr. Aldridge's hands demonstrating and Ruth's hands learning how to disassemble a movement without losing the small components that would roll off a bench and disappear into floor cracks. How to clean each part in solvent and dry it completely before reassembly. How to inspect a mainspring for fatigue by drawing it through your fingers and feeling for the microscopic roughness that preceded a crack. How to calibrate an escapement by turning the regulation screw a quarter turn at a time, and then listening, not measuring, listening, because Ruth could hear what other repairers had to measure. She could press her ear against the wooden case of a clock and tell you within 2 seconds per day whether it was gaining or losing time. Which side of the escapement swing was fractionally longer than the other, where in the gear train a pivot was beginning to bind. Mr. Aldridge retired in 1966. He sold her the shop for $1 and told her the price of the inventory was the 33 years she was going to spend taking care of it. Ruth ran that shop until her arthritis made the fine work impossible. And in all those years, through the watches and the clocks and the customers In the cold Massachusetts winters, she had done one other thing that mattered just as much to her as any repair she had ever completed. She had taught Nora. Nora had been 6 years old the first time she walked to Ruth's kitchen on a Saturday afternoon. She had come from the house on Federal Street in Greenfield, where she lived with her foster parents, a 2-mile walk she would make every Saturday for the next 12 years. Sylvia and Raymond Mercer were decent people, in the way that decent people are sometimes decent without being warm. They fed her, they clothed her. They drove her to school and to the dentist and to the church they attended on the first Sunday of each month. They did not love her, not in the way that you love a child who belongs to you. And Nora had understood this without being told the way children understand the essential arrangements of the households they live in quietly and completely without any drama. The Mercer children, 3 of them were first. Nora was second. Second meant a folding cot in the hallway alcove when the youngest Mercer boy turned 11 and needed his own room. Second meant a smaller portion of attention, a smaller claim on the household's patience, a smaller footprint in every room she moved through. She had learned by the age of 8 or 9 to calibrate her own presence, the way a clock is calibrated to occupy exactly as much space as the situation required, and not one fraction more. The only place this was not true was Ruth's kitchen. Ruth's kitchen on Elm Street smelled of solvent and machine oil, and the particular dry warmth of a room heated by an old cast-iron radiator that knocked and settled throughout the winter months. The kitchen table had been replaced years earlier by a proper watchmaker's bench 4 feet long, covered in a green rubber mat that had acquired the stains and tools marks of 30 years of careful work. A small wooden tray sat at one end for holding parts during disassembly. A gooseneck lamp was clamped to the near edge, its bulb positioned to throw clean light onto whatever was on the mat. The tools hung on a strip of pegboard above the bench. Tweezers in 4 sizes. Screwdrivers in 7 arranged from the smallest to the largest. A mainspring winder. A set of case knives. A timing block. And the loop, when Ruth was not wearing it, hung from a small brass hook at the left edge of the pegboard where she could reach it without looking away from the work. The first lesson had happened on Nora's first Saturday visit. She had been 6 years old, and she had arrived at the back door with a bruised knee from falling on the sidewalk. And Ruth had cleaned the knee and given her a glass of water, and then turned to the workbench and said without ceremony, "Come sit beside me." Nora had climbed onto the wooden stool. Ruth had set a small mantel clock on the mat, a dark case Seth Thomas that had been sitting on the shelf waiting for its owner to pick it up. "Put your ear against the case," Ruth said, "and tell me what you hear." Nora pressed her ear to the wood. The case was cool against her cheek. "Ticking," she said. Ruth said, "Listen harder. Listen past the ticking. The ticking is the outside of the clock. I want you to hear the inside." Nora had closed her eyes and let the sound move through her ear and into some place behind it. And beneath the ticking underneath it, she had heard something quieter. A small rhythmic whisper. A click and a release. A click and a release. Steady and precise and very faint, like the sound of something breathing carefully in a room where it did not want to be heard. "That is the escapement," Ruth said. "That is the heartbeat. If the heartbeat is even, the clock keeps time. If the heartbeat limps, if one side of the swing is longer than the other, the clock drifts. Can you hear it limping?" Nora listened for a long time. "No," she said. "It sounds even." "Good. It is even. This clock is healthy. Now I am going to show you a sick one." Ruth brought a second mantel clock from the shelf, a bracket clock whose owner had brought it in 3 days earlier, complaining that it was losing 15 minutes a week. Nora pressed her ear to the case. This one was different. The click on one side was fractionally louder than the click on the other. A tiny asymmetry small enough that she could not have put language to it, but present and unmistakable. A slight unevenness in the rhythm, like a person who walks with a limp. So slight you might not notice it until you have watched them cross an entire room. "That one is limping," Nora said. Ruth looked at her for a long moment, the way she looked at a movement she had just cleaned and reinstalled and started, and was listening to verify. The way she looked at something, she wanted to be sure she was hearing correctly before she said anything about it. "You have the ear," she said. It was the same sentence Mr. Aldridge had said to Ruth 25 years before. Nora did not know this then. She would not know it for many years. She was 6 years old, sitting on a wooden stool at her grandmother's workbench, and she did not understand what the sentence meant. But she understood that something had happened in that moment, that she had heard something correctly, that in this room, on this bench, on this stool, she was not second. She came back the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that. The Saturday visits continued for 12 years across 144 Saturdays, in which Nora sat on the wooden stool beside Ruth and learned everything that could be learned about the interior of clocks. How to remove a movement from its case without scratching the brass plates. How to identify fatigue in a mainspring by the faint stuttering quality of its unwind. The way it released its energy in small irregular pulses instead of the smooth continuous feed of a healthy spring. How to adjust the regulation screw without overcorrecting a quarter turn at a time, because patience in small increments was more reliable than confidence in large ones. How to clean a pivot bearing with a horsehair brush and solvent and then dry it completely before putting it back. Because moisture was the enemy of precision, and a single drop in the wrong place was enough to cause oxidation that would throw off the timing by the end of the month. Ruth taught by doing and by making Nora listen. She would adjust an escapement a quarter turn and let the clock run for 2 minutes and then ask what has changed. And Nora would press her ear to the case and say the left side of the swing is longer now. And Ruth would say correct. She would correct it. She would ask again. This was the entirety of the method. Do the thing. Listen. Report what you heard. Correct. Do it again. By the time Nora was 10, she could diagnose a fatigued mainspring by ear alone, holding a clock against the side of her head and listening for the subtle flutter in the gear train's rhythm that meant the spring was losing its elasticity. By the time she was 12, Ruth had let her do her first repair, replacing the mainspring in a small carriage clock that belonged to a retired professor who drove over from Deerfield Academy whenever his clocks needed attention. The professor had picked up the clock the following Saturday, held it to his ear, the way he had apparently been doing his whole life, and had gone still for a moment. Then he said, "It sounds younger." Ruth had said, "My granddaughter did the work." The professor had looked at Nora, a 12-year-old with dark hair and serious eyes, sitting on a wooden stool with a loop around her neck, and he had said, "Then I am going to bring you my grandfather clock next month." He had. She had repaired it. She was 12 years old, and she had replaced a worn suspension spring and recalibrated the escapement on a clock that stood 6 feet tall. And when the professor had come back and listened to it, he had not said anything for a long time. Then he had said to Ruth, "Her hands are steadier than yours ever were." Ruth had said, "That is true." By the time Nora was 16, she was doing most of the repair work herself. Ruth's arthritis had progressed to the point where the fine work was no longer possible for her hands, and she had shifted from doing to directing, sitting beside Nora at the bench and describing what needed to happen while Nora's hands made it happen. It was for both of them the most natural arrangement in the world. Ruth's knowledge lived in her ears and her memory. Nora's skill lived in her hands. Between them, they were one complete craftswoman, and the clients who came to Ruth's kitchen bench did not question the transition or did not care about it, which amounted to the same thing. What Nora had come to understand across those 12 years of Saturdays was that the work was not simply mechanical. The work was custodial. A clock that had been in a family for 3 or 4 generations was not a machine. It was a member of the household, a presence that had been keeping time through births and deaths and moves and marriages and all the ordinary catastrophes of a life. The women who brought their clocks to Ruth's bench were not asking for a repair. They were asking for a promise. The promise that the clock would continue for the next generation the way it had continued for the last. Nora had made that promise silently with every mainspring she wound and every escapement she balanced, and the making of it had been the closest thing to a calling she had ever experienced. It was the thing she had never found anywhere else. Not at the Mercer house, not at school, not in the small social arrangements of her teenage years. The experience of being necessary in a way that was specific to her and to no one else. A clock that needed a new suspension spring needed the person who knew how to fit one without over-tightening the bracket. The clock did not care about her living arrangements or her grades or the hierarchy of the household on Federal Street. The clock asked one question only: can you hear the difference between a healthy escapement and a damaged one? And she could. She always could. Ruth died when Nora was 18. A heart attack at the workbench on a Saturday morning in October, which was the kind of ending that suited Ruth dying at work, dying at the bench she had stood at for half her adult life. She had been holding a pocket watch when it happened, a client's watch, a 1940s Hamilton that had come in with a broken click spring, and she had set it down carefully on the mat before she went. Not dropped it, set it down, because Ruth Calloway did not drop watches, not even in the last seconds of her life, not even when her body was already making its final decision. Nora had been there. She had come in through the back door at 10 in the morning and found Ruth already gone, sitting upright in the chair beside the bench, the pocket watch on the mat, the shop light still burning the photograph from 1974, watching from its place on the shelf above. She had called the ambulance. She had waited on the kitchen floor with her back against the bench leg until they came. She had taken, when no one was looking, the loop from around Ruth's neck and the leather roll of screwdrivers from the bench drawer and the photograph from the shelf. These were the only things she took. The Mercers had not wanted them. The Mercers had not wanted any of it. The morning after Ruth's funeral, Nora had sat in the hallway alcove with her canvas bag across her knees and thought about what was gone. Not just Ruth, the kitchen, the bench, the Saturday mornings, the sound of the work lamp buzzing faintly when it had been on for more than an hour, the smell of solvent and warm metal and the particular dry heat of the old radiator, the wooden stool, all of it gone, because the things that had made that kitchen into a place were not the furniture or the tools or the walls. They were Ruth, and Ruth was gone. She had stayed with the Mercers for 8 more months after that, going to the kitchen on Saturdays, out of old habit, sitting at the table that was now just a table again, drinking tea from a mug that was just a mug, listening to the house that had returned to the particular silence of a place where no one is doing precise work. Sylvia Mercer had been kind in those months in the way people are kind when they sense they owe someone something but cannot calculate the exact amount. She brought Nora tea she had not asked for. She said from time to time that Ruth would have been proud. It was something to say. Nora received it as such. Then on a Wednesday evening in March, Sylvia had knocked on the doorframe of the hallway alcove and stood there with her hands folded in front of her and said that her daughter Deb was coming home from college, that Deb needed her room back, that Nora had 2 weeks to find somewhere else. Nora looked at her for a moment. "It is all right," she said. It was not all right, but it was not a surprise. She had been second for 14 years. Second ended when first came back. She had always understood this, had understood it the way you understand structural facts, the ones that do not change regardless of how you feel about them. She had simply not known the specific date until now. She packed her bag the following morning. She took the loop, the screwdrivers, the watch oil tin, the photograph, and the Hamilton pocket watch that had been on the bench when Ruth died, and that belonged to no one now because the client had never returned for it, which Nora decided to count as a form of inheritance. She had $380 in a savings account, 2 years of small repair jobs done on the side for clients of Ruth's who had kept bringing their pieces to Nora after Ruth's death. She had no car and no particular destination. She pulled the back door of the Mercer house shut behind her on a cold March morning and walked out onto Federal Street and did not look back. She had learned at 6 years old not to look back at that house. She spent the first 3 nights at a shelter in Greenfield and the 4th night in the waiting room of the Greyhound station because the shelter was full. She spent the 4th day walking, which was what she did when she did not know what else to do, because walking was cheaper than standing still, and it kept her body occupied while her mind sorted through the available options, which were not many and were not good. On the fifth day, she walked to Turner's Falls and spent money on a bowl of soup because it was cold and she was tired, and she had been making practical decisions for 4 days straight, and she needed an hour of warmth to think in. She was thinking when she heard the two men in the booth behind her. They were in their 70s, both of them, from the sound of their voices, and they were talking about old buildings in the valley, the way men who have lived somewhere their whole lives talk about it with the particular mixture of affection and complaint that comes from knowing a place too well to be impressed by it. One of them mentioned a building on Mill Street in Millbrook, a clockmaker shop that had been on the town's surplus list for years. Nobody wants it, the man said. Too small for any kind of real business, too old to insure properly. The town has been trying to get rid of it since about 2012. They finally sold it last month for $10 just to move it off the books. The other man said, wasn't that old Edmund Harlow's place? The clock man. That's the one. Shut it down in '69. Been sitting empty ever since. Nora turned around in her seat. She was not generally a person who turned around in her seat to interrupt the conversations of strangers. She was a person who occupied as little space as possible and made as little noise as was consistent with being present in a room. But something had moved in her chest at the name Harlow, a small specific shift, like the click of an escapement engaging. She knew the name. Ruth had mentioned it more than once across the Saturday years. Edmund Harlow had been the last real clockmaker in the Pioneer Valley, Ruth had said. Not a repairer, a maker. He could build a clock from raw brass and steel. I can repair one. There is a difference. Ruth had spoken about him the way you speak about someone whose work you respect at a distance you cannot close. And when Nora had asked once whether his shop was still standing, Ruth had said, as far as I know, no one has been inside it since he locked the door. Excuse me, Nora said. The man in the flannel shirt and suspenders looked at her with the mild, unhurried curiosity of someone who spends most of his time outdoors. Where is that shop? She said. Mill Street in Millbrook Center, he said. The little clapboard building next to the old Grange Hall. You'll know it by the boarded-up window and the sign that hasn't been painted since the Johnson administration. He paused, studying her with the kind of attention that comes from decades of reading weather and reading people. You interested? He said. Nora looked at him. She touched the loop at her collarbone. Yes, sir, she said. She walked out of the diner into the cold and stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the wind coming off the river 2 blocks away. 55 years. She began walking toward Millbrook. The town clerk's office was on the second floor of the Millbrook Municipal Building, a narrow brick structure on the main street with an American flag that needed replacing mounted above the entrance door. The office smelled of old paper and the institutional warmth of a wall-mounted electric heater that had been running since October. A woman in her late 50s sat behind the front desk and looked up when Nora came in and waited. My name is Nora Calloway, Nora said. I would like to inquire about the property on Mill Street, the old clockmaker's shop. The woman's name, according to the small placard on the desk, was Mrs. E. Patton. She regarded Nora for a moment with the calm, measuring look of a person who has been in the same position long enough that very few things catch her off guard. That property was sold 3 weeks ago, Mrs. Patton said. To whom? Nora said. Mrs. Patton tilted her head slightly. To the town, technically for the purpose of tax clearing, she said, and then immediately to a buyer. The transaction is complete and recorded. Nora felt something drop in her chest. I see, she said. She stood there for a moment with her hand on the strap of the canvas bag. Then Mrs. Patton said the buyer paid $10. Nora looked at her. The buyer, Mrs. Patton said carefully, walked in here with $10 in cash and a notarized letter of intent and left with a deed. She looked at Nora steadily. Are you the buyer? The silence in the room was very complete. Yes, Nora said. She reached into the front pocket of her canvas bag and took out her wallet. Inside were 2 $5 bills, which was the entirety of her cash money. She set them on the desk. Mrs. Patton looked at the 2 bills. Then she opened the middle drawer of her desk and took out a large brass key on a leather fob. The leather was old and dark, polished smooth along the grip from being handled across many years. She held it across the desk. That key is original to the building, Mrs. Patton said. Edmund Harlow's key. He locked the door in November of 1969 and brought this key to the predecessor of this office and set it on the counter and said, "Hold this for whoever comes next." She paused. "We have been holding it for 55 years. Nora took the key. "I need to tell you something," Mrs. Patton said. Her voice was even but deliberate. "There is a man named Frank Stiles who has called this office 3 times in the past month asking about that building. He asked to be notified if anyone made an inquiry." Nora held the key in both hands and said nothing. "Stiles used to work as a clockmaker," Mrs. Patton said. "Tried to open a repair shop in Northfield in the mid-70s, from what I understand. It did not last. He does small commercial real estate now, mostly in this valley." She paused. "I do not know precisely what his interest is in the Harlow building, but I think you should know that he has one and that he will be aware very shortly that someone has purchased it." "Why are you telling me this?" Nora said. Mrs. Patton was quiet for a moment, the way a person is quiet when they are deciding how precisely to say something they have already decided to say. Then she said, "Edmund Harlow was a very particular kind of man. He was a craftsman in a way that is difficult to explain to people who did not know him. He took care of things. He built things to last. He locked that shop believing that the right person would eventually come along who deserved what was inside it." She met Nora's eyes directly. "Frank Stiles, in my opinion, is not that person." Nora absorbed this. She held the key and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "What do you know about Harlow? About who he knew when he was working?" Mrs. Patton considered this. "He and the man who ran Aldridge's in Greenfield were acquainted," she said. "Known each other since they were young, from what I understand. Small trades in a small valley. The clock-making people all knew each other one way or another." She said this in the same even tone and then added, "I mention it because the connections in this valley tend to go deeper than people realize on first acquaintance." Nora nodded. One sentence, one name, and she set it aside in the back of her mind, the way you set aside a component you haven't found the purpose of yet. She thanked Mrs. Patton. She picked up her bag. She walked out into the cold afternoon and turned toward Mill Street. The shop was on the east side of Mill Street, third building, from the corner immediately north of the old Grange Hall, which had been converted into a yoga studio or a community meeting space. There were handmade flyers taped to the inside of its window that Nora did not stop to read. The clockmaker's shop was a narrow clapboard building, 2 stories, but the upper story was clearly uninhabited. The roof line slightly uneven in the way of old New England structures that had been settling into their foundations for a century. The front display window had been covered with plywood that had weathered to the same gray as the sky. Above the window, faded to near invisibility against the white clapboard, a painted sign in old-fashioned lettering. "Harlow and Sons, Fine Clocks and Instruments." Nora stood on the sidewalk and looked at the sign for a long moment. She put the brass key in the lock. It turned smoothly without friction or resistance, the way a well-made lock turns when the key that belongs to it is finally inserted after however many years of absence. One clean rotation. The door swung inward on hinges that protested with a sound that was more memory than complaint and held. She stepped inside. One long room. Plank floor dark with age but solid, no softness or give underfoot to suggest rot. Plaster walls off-white going to gray, cracked in several places along the upper corners and above the single rear window, which was unboarded and admitted the cold afternoon light in a long, pale rectangle across the floor. A pressed tin ceiling with a stamped floral pattern, dusty but completely intact, the individual stamped petals of the design still distinct and sharp. The smell of the room was dust and old wood and something else beneath those things. Something faint and specific and persistent, the ghost of machine oil and solvent that had soaked into the walls and the plank floor over decades of work and had not fully dissipated in 55 years of emptiness. She knew that smell. It was the smell of Ruth's kitchen on a Saturday morning. It was the smell of work that mattered. Along the left wall, a workbench, 4 feet long, maybe 5, with a row of small drawers fitted below it, each drawer with a small brass pull handle. Above the bench, a strip of pegboard with a small hook still in place where tools had once hung. Along the right wall, shelves running floor to ceiling, some of them still bearing the faint circular rings left by clock bases that had rested on them for years before being removed. And against the back wall, floor to ceiling, a master regulator clock. Nora went still. It was a tall case, perhaps 7 feet mahogany, dark with age, and the accumulated polish of decades of careful maintenance, the grain of the wood visible beneath the surface. A glass door on the front behind which the movement was visible, brass plates and the gear train between them, and the long brass pendulum hanging motionless from its suspension spring. The dial was white enamel with Roman numerals painted in black, and the hands black steel were stopped at 4:47. Whether morning or afternoon, she could not determine. The hands had not moved in 55 years. She crossed the room to the clock. She opened the glass door. The pendulum hung without motion, catching the thin light from the rear window and returning it in a dull gleam. The movement was visible behind the pendulum, the two brass plates that held the gear train between them, the escape wheel at the top of the train with its delicate teeth, the pallet fork that should rock back and forth, releasing one tooth at a time into the controlled fall that was the escapement's function. Everything was present, everything was in its correct position. But the mainspring barrel was empty, not missing, empty. The barrel was there, seated correctly in its arbor, the end of the winding shaft visible through the winding hole in the dial. But the spring itself had been removed, the coiled strip of tempered steel that stored the energy, the thing that made it go. Someone had deliberately taken out the heart of this clock. She looked more carefully at the movement and then at the back panel of the mahogany case. The panel was held by 6 brass screws. She leaned close and looked at them in the afternoon light. The screws were bright, noticeably brighter than everything else in the clock, brighter than the plates and the hands and the pendulum rod, all of which had aged into the same warm patina. Newer than everything else. Someone had installed those screws after the clock had already grown old, which meant someone had opened this panel years or decades after the clock was built. She went to the workbench and opened the drawers one by one. The first 3 held nothing. The fourth held a horsehair brush, a small bottle of dried solvent, and 3 screwdrivers that she recognized by their handles as proper watchmaker's tools. She took one and returned to the clock and began backing out the 6 bright screws one at a time, holding each one between her thumb and forefinger as it came free and placing them in a row on the window ledge beside the clock. The back panel came free. Behind it, in the space between the movement and the wall, a cavity approximately 8 inches deep. Inside the cavity, 3 things. A coiled mainspring in a brass barrel, the spring gleaming with a thin coat of oil that had prevented oxidation through all the years of waiting. A heavy canvas pouch tied at the neck with a length of twisted cord, its weight evident even from a distance. And a single sheet of paper folded in thirds, the fold lines brown with age. Nora stood before the open cavity without touching anything for a long moment. Then she reached in and took the letter. She unfolded it carefully. The paper was heavy, the kind made to be permanent, and the handwriting was precise and deliberate. The handwriting of a person who understood that how you wrote a thing was part of what you were saying. She read it. To whoever finds this spring, my name is Edmund Harlow. I have repaired and maintained the clocks of this valley from my father's bench since 1934, and from my own bench on Mill Street since 1952. Today is the 11th of November, 1969. I am closing this shop because the battery clock and the quartz movement have made my trade unnecessary to the people of this valley, and I am old enough to know when a chapter is finished. I am removing the mainspring from the master regulator because the spring is the clock. Without the spring, the clock is furniture. With the spring, it is alive. I am leaving it for the person who knows the difference. The tools in the bench drawers are yours. The contents of the canvas pouch are yours. They are what I have saved across 35 years of honest work, and they are yours because you found them, which means you are the kind of person who looks for what lies behind the visible surface of things. A clockmaker shop without a clockmaker is a room full of silence. The silence is not empty. The silence is waiting. Win the spring, start the clock. Edmund Harlow Clockmaker, November 11th, 1969. Nora read it twice. She folded it along its original crease lines and held it with both hands and stood in the cold, still room in the thin afternoon light for a long time. Then she reached into the front interior pocket of her canvas bag and found by touch alone the thing her hands had moved toward before her mind had fully formed the intention. A small piece of paper folded in quarters. The fold lines worn soft from being handled, opened and refolded many times in the 2 weeks since she had found it, tucked into the lining at the bottom of the canvas bag on the morning she had packed to leave the Mercer house. She did not know when Ruth had put it there. She only knew it had been there waiting for her to find it, which meant Ruth had put it there, knowing she would not be present when it was found, knowing Nora would need it without her there to explain it. The note said, "If you need to start over, find Harlow's on Mill Street in Millbrook. I left something there for you. Go when you are ready. You will know what to do when you get there." Nora stood in the empty shop with the letter from Edmund Harlow in one hand and the note from Ruth Calloway in the other hand, and the brass key on its leather fob looped over the wrist of the hand that held Ruth's note, and she looked from one piece of paper to the other and understood something that was not yet fully articulable. Ruth had been here. At some point in her life, Ruth had stood in this room and opened this panel and seen what was inside it, and she had left it. She had closed the panel and locked the door behind her and carried the knowledge of the room for however many years and given Nora only the address, not the gold. Ruth had either not known about the gold or had known and not taken it, which amounted to the same thing in either case. She had left it for whoever came next. She had left it for Nora. Nora set both pieces of paper on the workbench and reached into the cavity and lifted the canvas pouch. She untied the cord at the neck and opened the top and looked inside. Gold coins, small and bright even through decades of accumulated dust. She tipped the pouch and let a few slide into her open palm. Liberty Quarter Eagles, the obverse showing Liberty in her coronet, the reverse, the eagle with spread wings. She turned them over one by one and read the dates. 1908, 1923, 1941, 1955, 1965. She was about to set them back when the last coin in her palm caught the light differently from the others. She held it closer to the window. The reverse was standard, but scratched into the gold below the eagle in fine lines made by an engraver's point were 7 small characters. R.M. 1966. She went very still. R.M. Ruth Marsden. Her grandmother's name before she married and took the name Calloway. The name she had carried when she was a young woman learning the trade at Mr. Aldrich's bench. The name she had been carrying in October of 1966 when she would have been 24 years old. Harlow had known Ruth by name, had marked a coin for her, had left it here in 1969, 3 years after whatever had passed between them, sealed in the wall with the rest of it. This was not a coincidence that had sent Nora here. This was not good fortune or accident or the random operation of an indifferent universe. This was a plan made before she was born by a man she had never met for a person he had known briefly and trusted completely. She held the coin in her palm for a long time. Then she set it carefully back with the others and set the pouch on the workbench beside the 2 letters. She looked around the room, the empty pegboard above the bench, the shelves along the right wall, the pressed tin ceiling catching the last thin light of the afternoon. The master clock against the back wall, open its pendulum, motionless, its mainspring barrel waiting. A canvas pouch full of gold coins. 2 letters. A coin with 7 scratch characters that changed everything she thought she understood about how she had come to be standing in this room. She had $10 when she walked in. She had spent it all. She walked to the back of the shop and sat down on the plank floor with her back against the base of the master clock case. The wood was cold through her jacket. She pulled her knees to her chest. She closed her eyes, and she listened to the silence of the room. It was not the silence of the diner or the shelter or the Greyhound station or the hallway alcove of the Mercer house. Those silences had been the silence of absence, the silence of a place that had never particularly expected her to be in it. This silence was of a different kind entirely. This was the silence of a room that had been something specific and knew what it was and was waiting for the thing that would make it that again. The specific, dense silence of a clockmaker's shop in which no clock is ticking. Not empty, waiting. She sat on the cold plank floor in the failing afternoon light with her grandmother's loop around her neck and her grandmother's note in her pocket, and a letter from a dead clockmaker on the workbench beside her, and a gold coin with her grandmother's initials scratched into it. And she understood for the first time in her life that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not approximately, not close enough. Exactly. She said quietly to the open clock case above her head, "Thank you, Mr. Harlow. I will wind the spring." She slept on the floor that first night, with her jacket folded under her head, and the canvas bag against her side, and the brass key looped around her wrist. The plank floor was hard, and the room was cold, and she did not sleep well, but she slept, which was more than she had managed in the Greyhound station. And when she woke before dawn to the gray pre-light coming through the rear window, she lay still for a moment and listened to the room. The same silence. But something in it had changed, or something in her relationship to it had changed. She had told the room what she intended, and the room she felt had registered it. She got up and took stock. $380 in the savings account in Greenfield, accessible at any branch. The tools in the bench drawers. A canvas pouch of gold coins whose value she did not yet know precisely, and a mainspring in a brass barrel and a clock waiting to run. She walked to Greenfield that morning 4 miles on the river road in the early cold and was at the savings bank when it opened. She withdrew $200 in cash and walked to the coin dealer on Federal Street, a shop she had passed 100 times without ever having a reason to enter. The man behind the counter was in his 60s, and he looked at the coins she set before him without any visible expression for a long moment. Then he said, "Where did you get these?" "They were left to me," she said. He examined them carefully, several under his loupe, making notes in a small book in the unhurried way of a professional whose business depends on not revealing what he is thinking. After about 15 minutes, he set his pen down. "These are Liberty Quarter Eagles," he said. "They run from 1901 to 1965, most of them in good to very good condition. Several better than that. If you wanted to sell today, I would offer you 22,000. Retail replacement value is closer to 26." He looked at her steadily. "I would recommend you not sell today. Take them to at least 2 other dealers before you make any decision." She thanked him and took the coins and walked to a second dealer in Northampton that afternoon, who confirmed the estimate to within $800. She called the savings bank from a payphone and arranged to come in the following morning. She deposited the coins, had them appraised by the bank's consultant at $23,400, and opened a checking account into which the value once converted was transferred. She walked out into the cold late morning light and stood on the sidewalk for a moment and thought about what $23,000 meant. It meant she was not going to starve. It meant she had enough time to do the work properly. She spent carefully. The first week, a folding cot from the Salvation Army in Greenfield for $15, a wool blanket from the same rack for $8. A 2-burner propane camp stove from the hardware store in Turner's Falls, and a small tank to run it. A box of candles because the electrical service had been disconnected, and reconnecting it required an inspection and a waiting period. A library card from the Millbrook Public Library, because there were things she needed to know and books were free. She set the cot beneath the rear window where the morning light would arrive first. She set the propane stove on a wooden crate beside the back door. She arranged the tools from the bench drawers on the pegboard in the positions they belonged, tweezers at the left, screwdrivers by size, moving right brushes at the far end. She cleaned the bench surface and set the green rubber mat from her bag in the center. Then she turned to the master clock. The mainspring barrel was sitting on the window ledge where she had placed it that first afternoon. She carried it to the bench and examined it under the lamp she had rigged from a battery-powered work light clamped to the bench edge. She removed the cover and drew out the spring with the mainspring winder she had found in the second drawer, letting it uncoil in a controlled spiral onto the mat. She inspected every inch of it. running her thumb and forefinger slowly along the full length of the steel feeling for any roughness or variation in thickness that would indicate fatigue. The spring was clean. Whoever had removed and stored it had known exactly what they were doing. The oil coat was still adequate. The steel had not oxidized. After 55 years in a sealed cavity, the spring was as ready as it had ever been. She wound it back into the barrel. She seated the barrel in the clock's arbor, engaged the click. Spring oiled each pivot point with the watch oil from Ruth's tin. She did each step in the order Ruth had taught her, without rushing, without skipping anything, because Ruth had taught her that a repair done quickly was not a repair. It was a postponement. When every step was complete, she held the pendulum in her right hand and gave it a gentle push to the left and released it. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. The pendulum swung and returned, and at the precise moment the pallet fork engaged the escape wheel, the clock spoke. The tick expanded through the room, the way warmth expands when a fire is lit. Not loudly, not abruptly, but outward from a source reaching the plank floor, and the plaster walls, and the pressed tin ceiling, and settling into each of them, and the shop, which had been silent for 55 years, was no longer silent. Nora stood in the center of the room with her hands at her sides and listened. The escapement was even. Both sides of the swing equal the tick and the tock, precise mirror images, neither limping nor rushing. The gear train was running cleanly. She could hear in the quality of the sound the health of each component she had cleaned and oiled. The clock was not simply running. It was running correctly. The sound was right in the specific way Ruth had taught her to hear rightness, not the absence of wrong notes, but the presence of a particular tone, a precision and evenness that you either perceived or you did not. She heard it. She took the winding key from the bench drawer and gave the clock 6 full turns. The mainspring tightened. The clock's voice did not change. She set the hands to the correct time by the Hamilton pocket watch from the bench and watched the minute hand move with the slow certainty of a mechanism that had been correctly made and correctly set and knew its purpose. She sat on the workbench stool and listened to the clock for a long time. Mrs. Patton came to the shop that first Saturday afternoon carrying a cardboard box she set on the workbench without asking permission. Inside a coffee pot, a cast iron skillet, 2 plates, 2 mugs, a bag of ground coffee, a dozen eggs, a small jar of strawberry jam. She arranged these things on the workbench and then stood back and listened to the master clock ticking for a moment. "It sounds right," she said. "Yes," Nora said. "Good," said Mrs. Patton. She poured herself tea from a thermos she had carried in her coat pocket and sat on the wooden step inside the door and drank it without speaking further. When she finished, she rinsed the cup at the small utility sink that still functioned in the back corner, set it on the edge to dry, and left. She came back the following Saturday with a bookshelf her husband had been planning to discard. She came back the Saturday after that with a bag of apples and a pair of insulated work gloves. She never stayed long. She sat on the step and drank her tea and listened to the clock, and said each time she left that she would see Nora next week. She said it the way people say things they actually intend. Nora learned to patch plaster from a library book on historic building repair. She mixed the compound in a bucket, worked one section at a time, let each patch dry completely before touching it, sanded by hand. Her first patch cracked when it dried because she had applied it too thick, and she scraped it off and started again. By the end of her 3rd week, the front room walls were smooth and pale, and the pressed tin ceiling above them looked sharper against the clean plaster. The stamp pattern visible in a way it had not been when grime obscured it. She set Ruth's photograph on the shelf above the workbench. Ruth at the bench in 1974 loop, in her eye a pocket watch open on the mat in front of her. She set the Hamilton pocket watch wound and running on the bench beside the lamp, its tick a small, quiet counterpoint to the deeper voice of the regulator on the wall. She hung her coat on the hook beside the back door and set her boots on the floor beneath it. She arranged the shop the way she understood a clockmaker would arrange it, because she had been taught by someone who understood that a workspace was an extension of the discipline the work required. Everything in its position, nothing left where it did not belong. The first night she slept with the master clock running, was the first night in her life that she fell asleep in a room that sounded the way it was supposed to sound. She lay on the cot in the dark and listened to the tick move through the plank floor and the plaster walls and the pressed tin ceiling, and understood in the particular way you understand things at the edge of sleep that she had been searching for the sound without knowing she was searching for it. The first client came in the fourth week, not because Nora had advertised anything, but because word had moved through the valley the way word moves in small, connected communities, person to person along the web of relationships that connects any place where people have lived together for a long time. A retired school teacher from Deerfield named Mrs. Alcott arrived on a Tuesday afternoon carrying a bracket clock wrapped in a wool blanket. She set it on the workbench and said it had been her mother's and had not kept correct time since the house was moved 6 years ago, and that she had been told Ruth Calloway in Greenfield had died, and she did not know where else to bring it. Nora picked up the clock and held it to her ear. The escapement was running long on one side. The regulation screw had probably shifted during the move and had been running progressively off since. A quarter-turn adjustment, maybe two, and a cleaning of the pivot bearings where she could hear a faint resistance. She told Mrs. Alcott she could have it ready in 3 days. Mrs. Alcott looked at the master regulator on the wall and then back at Nora and said, "Ruth spoke highly of you." When had she spoken to Ruth, Nora asked. 2 years before she passed, Mrs. Alcott said. I asked her who would take care of my clocks when she was gone, and she said my granddaughter will have a shop somewhere in the valley, and you should find her. She said it the way she said everything, as if it were already settled, and only the calendar had not caught up yet. I will have it ready Thursday, Nora said. It was a small job, an hour of careful work, and when Mrs. Alcott came back Thursday morning and held the clock to her ear, she stood still for a long time before she said anything. It sounds like my mother's kitchen, she said. That was the kind of thing the client said. Not that it works or that it is fixed. That it sounds like something like a room they remembered or a person they had loved or a time when the world had a particular quality of steadiness they had not fully valued until it was gone. What Nora was repairing was never simply the mechanism. She was repairing the relationship between a clock and a memory, maintaining the promise that the sound a family had lived inside for generations would continue into the next generation and the one after that. It was a custodianship, not a service. She was thinking about this on the morning 3 weeks after she had opened the shop when the door opened and Frank Stiles came in. She knew who he was before he introduced himself from the way he stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame and his body half in and half out, as if he had not yet committed to entering. He was in his late 60s, heavy-set, wearing a down vest over a flannel shirt, and he was looking at the shop the way a person looks at a thing they had once wanted and had given up on and had never made peace with having given up on. There was something in his face that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but occupied the same territory as both. Frank Stiles, he said. He stepped inside and let the door close. Nora said, I know. He looked at her. Then he looked at the master regulator on the wall and stood looking at the pendulum swinging in its glass case for a long moment. That clock has not run since 1969, he said. Since 3 weeks ago, Nora said. He looked at the workbench, the tools on the pegboard, the photograph on the shelf, the small jobs lined up on the mat. His expression moved through several things she could not precisely identify. You have no business being here, he said. His voice was even, not loud, the voice of a man who has decided to say a difficult thing without drama. I bought this building, Nora said. You paid $10 for a property the county assessor values at $78,000, Stiles said. That kind of transaction is challengeable under Massachusetts property law. Inadequate consideration. A court could set it aside. It is how the previous owner intended it to be sold, Nora said. You cannot prove what Edmund Harlow intended, Stiles said. He has been dead for 20 years. There is no documentation. Nora watched him. He was not wrong about Harlow being dead. He was not wrong that she had no documentation beyond what Mrs. Patton had processed. She had a deed. She had a receipt. She did not have anything that explained the specific terms Harlow had set up. I know what you were, she said. He was quiet. Ruth Calloway told me about the clockmakers who had worked in this valley, Nora said. She talked about everyone who had worked the trade here at one point or another. She mentioned a man who had tried to open a repair shop in Northfield sometime in the mid-70s. She said he had the hands but not the patience. She said the shop lasted about 3 years. Stiles looked at her for a long moment. Something behind his expression shifted, though the expression itself did not change. "I am in real estate now," he said, as if this were an answer to something she had asked. "I know," she said. He went to the door. He stopped with his hand on the knob and turned back once more. "You should know," he said, "that this property had a prior interest. In 2019, a private buyer made a payment of $500 to the town's holding account for this parcel. The paperwork was not filed within the required window, so the transaction lapsed. But the prior attempt creates a documentary record of market interest that substantially complicates your $10 deed." He paused. "I have a real estate attorney. She is very good." He left. Nora stood behind the workbench after the door closed and did not move for a long time. She listened to the master clock ticking. She thought about what he had said. A transaction in 2019 that had lapsed. She did not know whether this was true or how to evaluate it. She knew only that he had an attorney and she did not, and that the distance between those two facts was exactly the distance he was planning to use. She sat on the stool and looked at the workbench. Ruth had sent her here. Ruth had known what was in this room and had trusted that finding it would be sufficient. Ruth had not left her a lawyer. Ruth had left her a note that said, "Go when you are ready, and you will know what to do when you get there." She did not, at that moment, know what to do, so she went back to work. The second week after Stiles's visit, a man came to the shop who was unlike any of the other clients. He did not carry a clock. He did not knock. He opened the door and walked directly to the master regulator and stood before it with his back to the room, the way a man walks towards something he has been thinking about for a very long time, purposeful and without hesitation. He was in his late 70s, lean with white hair cut close to his head, and hands that were large and still, and showed the particular wear of decades of fine work, the slight flattening of the fingertips, the specific calluses at the inside of the thumb and forefinger from 30 years of holding small tools. He wore a canvas jacket, and he stood before the master clock for a full minute without speaking, listening to the pendulum, his head slightly inclined. Then he said quietly, as if continuing a thought he had been having for some time, "That is the Harlow escapement." He set that beat himself. He had a preference for a slightly longer arc than standard. You can hear it if you know what you are listening for. He looked at Nora. "Who taught you?" he said. "Ruth Calloway," Nora said. "In Greenfield." He was quiet. "Then who taught her?" "A man named Aldridge," Nora said. "He ran the shop on Federal Street in Greenfield. He retired in 1966. The man looked at her steadily. He was Walter Crane, and she knew this the way she had known Stiles' name, not from any previous meeting, but from the manner of his arrival, from the quality of his attention, from the fact that he had heard the Harlow escapement in a clock he had not seen in more than 50 years, and named it correctly within the first minute. "Walter Crane," she said. He turned from the clock and looked at her. Then he came inside properly and let the door close and stood in the center of the room and looked at everything, the bench and the tools and the photograph and the repaired plaster and the pressed tin ceiling slowly and with the attention of a man taking inventory of something that matters to him. "I apprenticed here from 1963 to 1969, he said. "I was 17 when I started." He paused. "I was in this room the last afternoon Harlow worked. November 11th. He showed me how he removed the mainspring from the barrel. He showed me where he was putting it. He told me the building would eventually go to someone who deserved what was inside it, and that person would start the clock." He was quiet for a moment. "I drove past this street for 50 years, he said. I never stopped." "Why not?" Nora said. "Because Harlow did not send me," he said. "He told me I was a competent craftsman. He told me I would do honest work for the rest of my life, and that honest work was a worthy thing. But he told me the shop was for someone else. He said he would know that person had arrived when the clock was running." Walter reached inside his canvas jacket. He brought out an envelope, standard business size, white paper, now yellowed at the edges, sealed with red wax that had gone slightly brittle with age. He held it in both hands for a moment before extending it to Nora. "He gave me this on the day he closed the shop," Walter said. "He sealed it himself and told me to give it to whoever started the clock." She took the envelope. "He told me one other thing," Walter said. "He said Aldridge's people will come. When they do, give them the envelope." She heard the specific weight of the plural, not a specific person. Aldridge's people, as if Harlow had known there would be a succession of them, generation to generation, and had trusted the line to hold. She broke the wax seal. Inside were two documents. The first was a single sheet of paper notarized dated September 3rd, 1969, 2 months before Harlow closed the shop. A statement of intent signed by Edmund Harlow and witnessed by a Millbrook attorney declaring that the property at the Mill Street address was to be held by the town of Millbrook in custodianship and transferred to the next owner at a nominal price of $10 as an act of professional legacy in the tradition of the artisan trade. The document cited a specific provision of Massachusetts property law regarding nominal value transfers of artisan workshop properties and included a clause explicitly stating that this transfer superseded any prior or subsequent transaction made without the professional intent stipulated in the document. She read it twice. The second document was a single certified page from a Millbrook Town Council meeting in 2019 showing that a proposed transaction for the Mill Street property had been tabled due to incomplete documentation and had formally lapsed. The transaction had never been completed. The prior claim Stiles had mentioned existed. The paper in Nora's hand was its legal termination. She lowered the documents and looked at Walter. "He knew someone would try," she said. "He was a particular kind of man," Walter said. "He saw the long distance. He prepared for what was in it." She looked at the notary stamp. September 1969, 2 months before closing. He had written the letter in November and prepared the legal architecture for it in September, knowing he would need it, knowing he would not be there to provide it when it mattered. He had trusted a 17-year-old apprentice to hold an envelope for an indefinite period and deliver it to a person he had never met. And Walter Crane had held that envelope for 55 years and had brought it here on a cold afternoon in March because the clock was running again. She found a lawyer in Greenfield through Mrs. Alcott who knew everyone the way people know everyone when they have lived in a valley for 70 years. The lawyer reviewed the Harlow notarization and the lapse document and Walter Crane's signed statement and wrote a 2-paragraph response citing the specific statute Harlow had referenced in 1969. She did not hear from Stiles' attorney again. She thought about Stiles sometimes in the weeks that followed, not with anger but with a particular understanding of a person who had spent her entire life being measured against what she was and was not. He had wanted this place the way a person wants the thing they failed to become. He had wanted it not because he could have done what she was doing, but because possessing it would have meant something about what kind of person he was. He had not been that kind of person. He had left the trade at 26 because the patience it required was a patience he did not have. That was not something a building could retroactively provide. She had patience not because she had practiced it, but because she had been trained from the age of 6 to sit still and listen to something very small and hear in it everything that mattered. Walter Crane came back the following Saturday. He brought with him a set of pivot gauges and a mainspring testing device that had belonged to Harlow, kept in a toolbox in his barn since 1969, without his being able to explain precisely why he had kept them. He set them on the bench and said they should be here. Then he sat on the wooden step inside the door and watched Nora work on the bracket clock from Mrs. Alcott, which had developed a secondary issue she had not fully addressed in the first repair. He did not tell her what to do. He did not offer advice unless she asked. He sat with his large, quiet hands on his knees and watched with the specific attention of a craftsman, watching someone else do the work, which is full of recognition and restraint. After a while he said, "You hear the train before you see it." "I know," she said. "Ruth taught me." He was quiet. Then Harlow said the same thing. He said it often enough that it stopped sounding like instruction and started sounding like weather. She finished the adjustment on the bracket clock and set the pendulum going and listened. She looked up at Walter. He said from the step in the quiet tone of a man reporting an observed fact that is correct. It was the validation of a craftsman who knew what correct sounded like, and it was the most useful thing anyone had said to her in weeks. That evening after Walter had gone, Nora stood at the workbench in the lamplight and looked at the tools on the pegboard. She knew the tools now. She had used most of them. She knew which screwdriver had the slightly loose handle that required a compensatory grip, which tweezers had been resharpened so many times that the tips were fractionally asymmetric and needed allowance. She knew them the way she was beginning to know the shop. Not as inherited objects, but as things that had been put to specific purposes by a specific kind of person, and that retained something of that purpose. She began opening the bench drawers again, one at a time, the way she was doing everything in this room carefully and without rushing, holding each drawer fully out and looking at the cavity behind it. She had learned in this shop that the visible surface of things was only the first layer. The first 6 drawers were as she had found them. The 7th, the bottom right, was the deepest. She drew it fully out and set it on the bench and looked at the back of the cavity. There was a thin wooden panel at the back, the same color as the bench frame, invisible, unless you removed the drawer completely and looked directly at it with a light. She would not have seen it at all, except that the lamp was angled slightly toward the back of the bench and caught the edge of the panel and showed the thin line of shadow that was its seam. She ran her thumb along the seam. The panel was held by friction alone. She pressed one corner and the opposite corner released. She lifted the panel free. Behind it, in a cavity perhaps 4 inches deep and 8 inches wide, a single object, a small clock, handmade. The case constructed of brass sheet bent and soldered by hand, small enough to hold in both palms the surface finished with a file and then a burnishing tool that had left fine parallel lines across the brass. The dial was bone, not enamel, the numerals painted in black with a fine brush. The hands were blued steel, hand-formed. The movement visible through a small glass window cut into the back of the case was an original construction, not a purchase movement set into a manufactured case, but a movement built from individual components by the same person who had built the case. Harlow had made this, every part of it from raw material by hand. It was the work of the specific kind of craftsman Ruth had described, the man who could build a clock from raw brass and steel. She lifted it carefully from the cavity. It was cold from decades in the dark. She turned it over in her hands and examined every surface. On the bottom of the case, scratched into the brass with an engraver's tool, a date and 4 words. November 1969. For whoever listens. She set it on the bench and looked at it for a moment. Then she found the winding square on the dial and gave the key a careful half-turn, not knowing the state of the mainspring, not wanting to overstress it. The mainspring took up the tension. The gear train engaged. The balance wheel began to oscillate. And then from a small cam-driven music attachment fitted to the going train, the clock produced a sound she was not expecting. 8 notes, a simple ascending and falling phrase, the kind of melody that sounds as though it has existed longer than anyone can remember. It played once and then rested as the cam completed its rotation. 8 notes, the melody of something she had heard before, something she had lived inside for years without ever asking where it came from. A melody so familiar that for a moment she could not locate why it was familiar. The way you sometimes fail to identify a smell until the second breath brings it into full clarity. The third breath. She stood behind the workbench with the handmade clock in her hands and the 8 notes still present in the air of the shop, and understood. Ruth used to hum it. Not during the formal instruction, not during the repairs themselves, but in the small spaces between, while waiting for something to dry, while making tea, while sitting at the kitchen bench, looking out at the elm tree in the early light of a Saturday morning before Nora arrived. A small melodic habit, the kind of thing a person does so regularly it becomes part of the texture of a room, indistinguishable from the radiator's knock or the lamp's faint buzz. Nora had heard that melody on 100 Saturday mornings without ever asking where it came from, without ever thinking to ask, because it was simply part of what Ruth's kitchen sounded like. It had come from here, from this shop, from this small brass clock that Harlow had made with his own hands and sealed in the back of a bench drawer in November of 1969. Ruth had been here. She had stood in this room and wound this clock and heard those 8 notes and had carried them home, and they had become part of the sound of Saturday mornings in the kitchen on Elm Street for the rest of her life. Nora set the clock down on the bench mat very gently beside the Hamilton pocket watch. She looked at the photograph of Ruth above the bench. Ruth at the workbench in 1974, the loop in her eye, the pocket watch open on the mat, the lamplight on her face. The shop was full of a sound now, the master regulator keeping its deep, unhurried beat on the wall, the Hamilton running its lighter tick beside the lamp, and now the handmade clock with its 8-note melody that had traveled from this room to a kitchen on Elm Street and back again across 50 years. Nora stood in the lamplight and listened to all of it. Spring came to the Pioneer Valley not as a single event, but as an accumulation of small changes, 1 degree at a time. The river ice going gray before it broke the elm trees on the roads out of Greenfield, putting out their first cautious buds. On Mill Street in Millbrook, the season made itself known through the rear window of the shop, the light arriving a few minutes earlier each morning and falling at a slightly changed angle across the plank floor, so that the rectangle of pale light that had been landing on the workbench leg in January was landing on the bench surface itself by April, and by May fell across the row of clocks waiting for attention in a long warm stripe that made the brass cases glow. The shop had a rhythm now, and spring arrived inside it the way spring arrives in a working room. Not as a season, but as a change in the quality of the morning light and the temperature of the tools under her hands, incremental and without announcement. She noticed it the way Harlow had probably noticed it, the way Ruth had noticed things without ceremony. The plank floor had been swept and mopped until the grain of the wood was visible again, and the boards no longer grated underfoot. The walls were smooth and pale, and the pressed tin ceiling caught the morning light and scattered it gently across the room. The tools on the pegboard hung in their positions with the ease of things that belong where they are, and the green rubber mat on the bench surface had acquired the small particular stains of a working surface, each one the record of a specific repair, a specific clock, a specific family's history passing through her hands on the way to the next generation. The clients came. They came slowly at first, and then more steadily, the word moving through the valley along the same paths that word had always moved from one household to the next, from a mention at a hardware counter to a conversation after church. A retired minister from Conway brought in a Vienna regulator that had been in his family since the Civil War, the suspension spring broken and the pendulum rod slightly bent from a fall sometime in the previous decade. A woman from Montague brought a ship's clock that had belonged to her grandfather, a merchant sailor who had carried it across 30 years of ocean voyages. A farmer named Merritt from Gill drove 40 minutes with a pocket watch in a small velvet box, a railroad-grade Hamilton that had been in the same family since 1912, and set it on the bench without speaking and waited. "When did it stop?" Nora said. "3 years ago," he said, "after my father died." He paused. "I do not know whether something is broken or whether I have simply not been winding it." She held the watch to her ear, silent. She opened the case and examined the movement. The mainspring was intact. She inserted the winding key and gave it 2 careful turns. The watch began to run. She held it to her ear again. The escapement was slightly off the left side of the swing, fractionally longer than the right, a drift of perhaps 3 seconds per day. She told him. She told him she would adjust the regulation and clean the pivots and have it ready the following week. He looked at her. "You sound like you know what you are hearing," he said. "I was trained to," she said. He came back the following Wednesday and held the watch to his ear and stood still for a long time. Then he looked at her and said, "My father carried this watch every day for 40 years. "I know," Nora said. She knew the category of the thing, the weight of what a watch like this carried beyond its mechanical function. She knew because Ruth had taught her, and Ruth had known because Mr. Aldridge had taught her, and the knowledge had come down through hands and ears across 3 generations to this bench. Merritt paid without negotiating and walked out. She heard his truck start on Mill Street and pull away, and the shop returned to the voice of three clocks, the regulator on the wall, the Hamilton on the bench, and Harlow's handmade clock on the shelf beside Ruth's photograph. She had wound the handmade clock every morning from the second day after finding it using a small key she had found taped to the inside of the hidden panel, which she recognized as exactly the kind of precaution a particular kind of man would take. The clock ran for 36 hours on a full wind and needed winding again, which she did every morning at the same time she wound the Hamilton. The 8 notes played each time the cam completed its rotation once per hour, and she had come to hear them as she heard the master regulator's tick as part of the shop's voice, part of its particular texture of sound. She was standing in the center of the room with her eyes closed on a Tuesday morning in late April when the thing happened that she had not prepared for. A woman named Dolores Weston arrived from Northampton carrying a wall clock with both arms against her chest. She set it on the bench and stepped back. "My great-grandmother brought this from Pennsylvania in 1908, Dolores said. "Every house in our family has been set by this clock since then." Nora looked at the clock, an E. Howard regulator-style wall clock, late 19th century walnut case. Convex glass pendulum door, white enamel dial. A good clock, well kept. The pendulum was motionless and the hands were stopped. "What is the complaint?" Nora said. "It gains about 15 minutes a day," Dolores said, "which it has never done before, and last week it stopped entirely." Nora examined the clock where it sat. She could see from the position of the regulation nut that it had been moved recently, probably by someone who had noticed the gaining and attempted to correct it, but had moved it the wrong direction, accelerating the gain until the escapement threw off enough to stop the movement entirely. A straightforward repair. Reset the regulation, clean the escapement, check the suspension, spring run it for 24 hours to verify the rate. She told Dolores this. She said she could have it ready Thursday morning. Dolores looked at her with the expression clients wore when they were handing over something irreplaceable. It was not distrust. It was the expression of a person standing at the edge of a promise, waiting to see if it would hold. "Ruth Calloway used to take care of this clock," Dolores said. "Her mother brought it to Ruth." "I know," Nora said. "Ruth told my mother you would be here eventually," Dolores said. "She said when you find her, she will do right by it." "I will have it ready Thursday morning," Nora said. Dolores left. Nora turned to the clock on the bench and began the examination in the order Ruth had taught her, from the outside in, from the visible to the precise. She was on the suspension spring when it happened. She had the clock lifted slightly from the bench, holding it by the case sides to examine the suspension spring bracket at the top of the movement, and her left hand shifted a fraction of an inch as she tilted the clock toward the lamp. The clock came out of her grip on the left side and rotated, and she caught it with both hands, but not before the case had swung and the glass pendulum door had struck the iron lamppost. The sound was small, a precise, definite tap. She set the clock down immediately and looked at it. The convex glass of the pendulum door had a crack, a single clean crack running from the bottom left corner to the center, not shattering, but cracked permanently and irrevocably cracked. And the minute hand had been displaced by the impact, bent at a slight angle away from the dial surface, the thin blued steel of it catching the lamplight differently than it should. She stood behind the bench and did not move. The crack was not catastrophic. A piece of curved glass of that age and type was replaceable, though not easily and not cheaply. The hand could be very carefully straightened, though blued steel that has been bent once is never entirely the same as steel that has never been stressed. The clock was not destroyed, it was damaged, and it had been in one family since 1908, and Ruth had taken care of it for 30 years. And Dolores Weston had carried it here with the particular care of someone who understands that what they are carrying is not simply an object. Nora stood at the bench for another minute. She was waiting, she understood, to see what she would do. She was standing at the choice between the easier version of herself and the accurate version. She was waiting to see which one would act. She picked up the telephone installed behind the bench and called the number Dolores had left on the repair slip. Dolores answered on the third ring. Nora told her what had happened. She described the crack precisely. She described the bent hand. She said, I am sorry. This was my fault and I am going to fix it, and I am not going to charge you for any part of the repair. There was a silence on the other end of the line. Then Dolores said, Is the movement all right? Yes, Nora said. The movement is undamaged. Another silence. Dolores said, What are you going to do? Nora told her. She had already identified while waiting for Dolores to answer a stained glass and antique glazing specialist in Northampton who worked with curved antique glass. She had already located a hand supplier in Connecticut who stocked period-correct blued steel hands for E. Howard movements. She would pay for everything herself. She would not charge Dolores for the repair or the parts or the glass. Dolores listened to all of this. Then she said, My mother brought this to Ruth Calloway for 30 years, and Ruth never broke anything. I know, Nora said. I am sorry. The silence lasted long enough that Nora understood it was not going to resolve in her favor without cost. She held the phone and waited. Then Dolores said, When will it be ready? Those 4 words were not forgiveness. They were something between forgiveness and a test. The acknowledgement of a person who had decided to give someone the opportunity to correct a mistake before judging them by it. 2 weeks, Nora said. I will call you when I have the glass. She drove to Northampton the following day and sat with Mrs. Farnsworth, a woman of about 70 who had been working with antique glass for 4 decades. Together, they measured the door frame and the curve of the original glass fragment Nora had preserved. Mrs. Farnsworth said she could have a replacement in 10 days, $120. Nora paid from the checking account and drove back to Millbrook. She ordered the hands from Connecticut that same afternoon. She ordered both the minute and the hour, because once the minute hand was replaced, the hour hand needed to match it in the quality of the bluing and the way the steel caught light. She worked on other clocks while she waited. The Vienna regulator, a bracket clock from a family in Sunderland, the ship's clock from Montague. She worked steadily and carefully, and the shop moved at the pace of the master regulator on the wall, unhurried and certain. Mrs. Farnsworth called on the 9th day to say the glass was ready. Nora drove to Northampton and carried it back in a padded box. She fitted the new glass carefully, working the clips into place around the perimeter, testing the fit at each point before securing it. The glass matched the profile of the original within a tolerance that would not be visible without knowing what to look for. She replaced both hands under the loop, the blued steel bright under the lamplight. She reinstalled the movement, adjusted the regulation, set the pendulum going, and ran the clock for 36 hours on the bench, checking the rate every 12 hours against the Hamilton. The clock gained 8 seconds in 36 hours. She adjusted the regulation nut a quarter turn. She ran it for another 12 hours. 2 seconds gain. She adjusted again 1/8 turn. She ran it for 24 hours. 1 second. She adjusted the final fraction and ran it for 48 hours, checking twice daily. And by the end of the 48 hours, the clock was losing 2 seconds per day, which was within the acceptable tolerance of a spring wound regulator of that age. A clock that was alive in the way that a living thing is, never quite stationary, always moving within its proper range. She called Dolores on a Thursday morning. Dolores came the following Saturday alone, without the particular tightness Nora had seen in her face on the first visit. She stood before the clock on the bench and looked at the glass and the hands. She opened the door and looked at the pendulum. She closed the door and stood back. Then she held the clock to the side of her face the way Ruth had held clocks, the way a person holds something they know how to listen to. She stood there for a long time. Then she set the clock on the bench and looked at Nora directly. You called me before I had any idea, Dolores said. Yes, Nora said. You could have fixed it and I would never have known. Yes. Dolores was quiet for a moment. Then she said, My mother said Ruth was the most honest craftsman she had ever known. She would hand over a clock and say I was looking at the mainspring and noticed the suspension spring was also starting to go, so I replaced it, no additional charge. She never waited to be asked, and she never pretended. She saw what needed doing, and she did it. Nora said nothing. Dolores said, What do I owe you? I told you on the phone, Nora said. Nothing. Dolores looked at her for a moment. Then she reached into her coat pocket and set four $50 bills on the workbench. That is for the glass and the hands and your time, she said, and for calling me. Nora looked at the money. She thought about saying she could not accept it, but that would have been a kind of performance, a demonstration of modesty that served no one. She picked up the bills and said thank you. Dolores wrapped the clock in the blanket she had brought and held it against her chest. My great-grandmother carried that from Pennsylvania in the back of a wagon, she said. It kept time for her through the Depression and the war, and through everything that came after. She looked at Nora. I will bring it back next year. She left. Nora stood at the bench and looked at the spot where the clock had been, and then at the photograph of Ruth above the bench. Ruth at the workbench in 1974, the lamplight on the concentration in her face, the full attention of a person doing work they know how to do for reasons that extend beyond the work itself. The thing Ruth had tried to teach her about custodianship, about the promise that a repair carried, she understood it differently now than she had understood it before the phone call to Dolores. She had understood it as a principle intellectually, as a truth about the relationship between craft and history. She understood it now as something she knew in her body through the 3 days of the cracked glass sitting on the bench, through the phone call she had made before she was ready to make it, through the knowledge that she had damaged something that was not hers to damage. The making of a promise was easy. The keeping of it was the cost. She had kept it. She was thinking about this on a Thursday afternoon in early June when Mrs. Patton knocked on the open door of the shop. Not a Saturday visit. Mrs. Patton was wearing her town clerk's expression rather than her Saturday expression, which were distinct and separately readable to anyone who had known her long enough. She was carrying a small envelope, cream-colored, heavier than standard paper, not sealed and not addressed with the particular softness of paper that has spent many years in a desk drawer. Mrs. Patton came to the bench and set the envelope down. This was in the town's file on the Harlow property, she said. Not in the general file, in a secondary file that I did not locate until I was reorganizing the property archives in February. She paused. There was a note attached to it in Harlow's handwriting saying it was to be given to the new owner of the property after they had operated the shop through one full season. She looked at Nora steadily. You have been here since March, she said. Today is the first Thursday of June. That is one full season by any reasonable measure. Nora picked up the envelope. The paper was heavy under her fingers. Mrs. Patton said, I will get my tea, and went to the back of the shop where she had long since learned where everything was kept. Nora sat on the stool and opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the same heavy stock as the letter from the clock cavity, the same deliberate handwriting, 3 full paragraphs. She read slowly. To the person who wound the spring and ran the shop through a full season. If you are reading this, you have done what I asked. You have done more than that. You have done what the shop needed. I want to tell you something about how you came to be here, because you deserve to know the history you have been given. In 1966, a young woman came to my shop from Greenfield. Her name was Ruth Marsden. She had been learning the trade with Henry Aldridge on Federal Street for 5 years, and Aldridge had sent her to me because he believed her ear was finer than anything he had encountered, and finer than anything he could continue to develop. Henry Aldridge was my cousin. We had known each other since we were boys, and we had come to the same trade from different directions. He through the jeweler side, and I through the pure clockmaking. And we had spent 30 years arguing about the correct way to set an escapement, and had both been right and wrong in roughly equal proportions across those years. Henry wrote me in 1966 that he had a student whose pitch discrimination was beyond what he had encountered in a career of looking for it, and that I should hear her. I agreed to meet her. She came on a Tuesday afternoon in October. She stood in the door of this shop and listened for perhaps 30 seconds before she said, Your master clock is gaining about 2 seconds per day on the left side of the swing. She was correct. I had not yet found time to address it. I showed her everything, the shop and the bench and the tools and the room in the back of the master clock. I told her what was in the room, and I told her to leave it. I told her the room was for someone else. She asked who. I told her the student you are going to spend the rest of your life finding. When you have found that student and trained that student and that student is ready, send them here. Tell them to look for the spring. She was 24 years old, and she had not yet met the man she would marry, or had the son she would have, or taken on the granddaughter who would become her true student. She could not have known in October of 1966 who that student would be or when they would arrive. She only knew what I had told her, which was that the room would wait and the spring would keep, and that the person she was looking for would be identifiable by a single quality. Not skill, which can be learned. Not knowledge, which can be acquired. The quality I told her to look for was the ear, the specific and unteachable neurological gift for hearing the interior of a clock, for hearing past the outside sound to the mechanism beneath it. The gift that Aldridge had recognized in her and that I confirmed on a Tuesday afternoon in October when she heard my master clock gaining 2 seconds per day from the doorway. She came back once, I believe, after she set up her own kitchen bench in Greenfield. She came to look at the room. She left everything as she found it and did not tell me she had been there, which was correct because the room was not for her. She was keeping faith with the instruction, which was to leave it for the right person. I do not know who you are. I could not have known. But I know that Ruth Marsden found you because you are here. I know she trained you because the clock is running correctly. And I know that she understood when she sent you here that the chain of instruction does not end. It continues. You know what to do. Edmund Harlow Clockmaker, November 11th, 1969. This letter to be delivered after one full season of operation. Nora sat on the stool with the letter in both hands and looked at the far wall of the shop. She thought about Ruth on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1966, 24 years old, standing in this doorway, hearing the master clock gaining 2 seconds per day on the left side of the swing from 30 feet away. She thought about Ruth going home from that visit and continuing her work in Greenfield, repairing the clocks of the valley for 30 years. And somewhere in those 30 years, meeting a 6-year-old girl placed in foster care and recognizing in her on the first Saturday the thing she had been asked to look for and had perhaps been looking for without knowing she was looking. She thought about Ruth at the end of her life tucking a small folded piece of paper into the bottom lining of a canvas bag, writing in her arthritic hand the address on Mill Street, trusting the note to be found at the right moment, trusting the right moment to announce itself. And she thought about the coin with RM 1966 scratched into the gold. Harlow marking a coin for the young woman from Greenfield who had stood in his doorway and heard his clock from 30 feet. The coin sitting in the wall for 55 years. Not the gold, the acknowledgement, the specific recognition from one craftsman to another that she had had the ear and had used it well and had sent the right person. Ruth had known. Not vaguely and not sentimentally. With the precision that Ruth brought to everything at the bench, every quarter turn of a regulation screw, every assessment of a mainspring's remaining elasticity. She had known that Nora had the ear since the first Saturday. She had spent 12 years confirming what she already knew. Training the hands to match the ear, preparing the whole instrument that the craft required. And then she had pointed that instrument toward Mill Street and trusted it to find its way. Mrs. Patton came back from the propane stove with her mug of tea and sat on the step inside the door. Nora looked up from the letter. She looked at Mrs. Patton's face, which was showing nothing specific, only the calm, patient waiting of a person who has been in the same position long enough to know that some things require time to be received properly. She knew, Nora said. Mrs. Patton wrapped both hands around her mug. My sense of it, Mrs. Patton said carefully, is that she knew for a very long time. That everything she did from the day she came here and left the room alone was preparation. She paused. She was, from what I understand, a very precise woman. Yes, Nora said. Precision like that, Mrs. Patton said, does not stay at the bench. It carries into everything a person does. Nora folded the letter along its original crease lines. She held it for a moment before setting it on the bench beside the first letter, Harlow's letter from the clock cavity. 2 letters from the same hand. The first found in a clock on the first afternoon. The second found in an archive after one full season of work. Both waiting, Both delivered exactly as intended. 2 weeks later, on an evening in mid-June, the phone rang. She almost did not answer it because she was in the middle of adjusting the suspension spring on the minister's Vienna regulator, and she did not like to stop in the middle of a suspension spring adjustment, the delicacy of the work being disrupted by interruption. But the phone rang 4 times, stopped, and rang again, which suggested the caller had hung up and redialed, which suggested it was not routine. She set the regulator down carefully and picked up the phone. The voice on the other end was Sylvia Mercer. She identified herself with a slight carefulness, the way people identify themselves when they are not certain whether they will be received. She said her name and then said, "I hope I am not disturbing you." Nora said, "You are not disturbing me." A brief silence. Sylvia said, "I heard you have a shop now. I heard it is going well." Nora said, "Yes." Another silence. Sylvia said, "I am glad. I want you to know that I am genuinely glad." She said this in the particular way of someone who has rehearsed a sentence and is delivering it as close to the rehearsed version as possible, which meant the gladness was real, even if the delivery was effortful. "I know that things were not always what they should have been when you were with us. I want you to know I think about that." Nora held the phone and said nothing. Sylvia said, "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman. I should have said that more often and more clearly when you were with us." Nora said yes, she was. The silence that followed was the silence of two people who have said the important things and are standing on the far side of them in the quieter territory that exists after the necessary words have been spoken. Sylvia said, "I will not keep you." Nora said, "Thank you for calling." She set the phone down and stood at the bench and held the weight of the 4-minute call. It was not what the child on the folding cot in the hallway alcove had needed. That child had needed something that no 4-minute phone call could retroactively provide. But the child on the folding cot was not the person standing at this bench. The person standing at this bench had Ruth's loop around her neck and Harlow's tools on the pegboard above her and a master regulator ticking on the wall that had been silent for 55 years before she had come through the door. The person standing at this bench did not require Sylvia Mercer to have been different than she was. The person standing at this bench was exactly where she was supposed to be, and the road to exactly here had been prepared for her long before she was old enough to walk 2 miles on a Saturday to a kitchen on Elm Street and press her ear against a mantel clock and hear the difference between a healthy escapement and a limping one. She went back to the Vienna regulator's suspension spring. She finished the adjustment. The clock ran correctly. On a Saturday morning in late September, a woman came to the shop with a child. The woman was in her early 40s and carried a clipboard and wore the particular professional warmth of a person whose work involved managing difficult situations on behalf of people who had not asked to be in them. She introduced herself as Ms. Ellison, a family services worker from the Department of Children and Families in Greenfield. She explained that she brought children in her care on visits to small businesses and workshops in the valley as part of an enrichment program. She had heard about the shop from Mrs. Alcott, who had heard from Mrs. Patton, and she wondered whether Nora would be willing to spend a few minutes with a child. The child was standing slightly behind Ms. Ellison, which was where children stood when they were not yet certain whether the place they had arrived at was safe. She was about 7 or 8 small for her age, with dark braided hair and very still eyes that were taking in the room without appearing to move. She was wearing a blue coat that was slightly too large for her, with sleeves that came a little past her wrists. The particular fit of a coat that had been someone else's before it was hers. Nora recognized that fit. She had worn it herself for most of her childhood. Nora looked at the child and then at Ms. Ellison and said, "Please come in." They came in. The child moved through the doorway the way children move when they are curious, but have learned caution. Small, careful steps, pausing, her eyes going from the master regulator on the wall, to the tools on the pegboard, to the row of clocks waiting on the bench, to the photograph above it. She stopped in front of the master regulator and looked up at it. The pendulum swung in its glass case. The hands moved at the pace that hands are supposed to move. The voice of the clock filled the room the way it always did, steady and unhurried and certain. The child stood before the clock with her head slightly tilted to one side. Nora watched her and said nothing. After about 30 seconds, the child turned and looked at Nora with the direct, serious look that children use when they have decided to trust someone enough to ask a real question. "What does it sound like inside?" the child said. Nora was still for a moment. "That is the right question," she said. She crossed the room and knelt down beside the child so that they were at the same height. She reached up and took the loop from around her neck and held it in her open palm. The child looked at it. "My grandmother gave me this," Nora said. "She taught me to hear what the clock sounds like inside, not the ticking which anyone can hear. The inside sound underneath the ticking." The child looked at the loop and then at the clock. "Can you hear the inside sound?" she said. "Not yet," Nora said, "but I can teach you how to listen for it." She stood up and went to the bench and took down the small mantel clock she kept at the end of the bench. For this purpose, the New Haven bracket clock she had repaired for Mrs. Alcott, borrowed back with Mrs. Alcott's bemused permission for reasons Nora had not fully articulated to herself at the time, though she understood the reason clearly now. She brought the clock to where the child was standing and held it out. "Put your ear against the case," Nora said, "and tell me what you hear." The child leaned forward and pressed her ear to the dark wood of the case. She was still for a moment with the particular quality of stillness of a child who is genuinely listening rather than performing the act of listening for an adult's approval. Her eyes closed. Her hands came up and pressed gently against the sides of the case. "Ticking," she said. Nora said, "Now listen harder. Listen past the ticking. The ticking is the outside of the clock. I want you to hear the inside." The child was still for longer this time. Much longer. Nora waited. Ms. Ellison, standing a few feet behind them, was also quiet. The child said slowly, as if she were describing something she was not yet certain she was permitted to trust, "It sounds like something breathing." Nora went still. "That is the escapement," she said. "That is the heartbeat. If the heartbeat is even, the clock keeps time." She watched the child lift her head from the case and look at the clock with the particular look of a person who has just heard something for the first time that changes the quality of the world slightly permanently in the way the world changes when a new sound is named for you, and you understand that it has always been there and you simply did not know to listen for it. Nora held the clock and looked at the child and understood what this moment was. Not simply the continuation of a line of instruction, the reason the line existed. This was what Harlow had been preparing for when he sealed the mainspring in the clock cavity in November of 1969. Not only for Nora's arrival, for this, for the next link in a chain that he had trusted would hold across whatever time and circumstance lay between his shop and whatever shop came after and the shop after that. The chain of instruction does not end. It continues. She said, "Your ear is very good." The child looked at her. "What does that mean?" she said. Nora thought about how to say it. She thought about the kitchen on Elm Street and the wooden stool and Ruth's face in the lamplight of a Saturday morning. She thought about Mr. Aldridge in Greenfield in 1961, setting 3 watches on a glass counter and watching a 19-year-old shop girl point to the correct one in 10 seconds. She thought about Harlow in this room in 1966, standing before his master clock and listening to a 24-year-old woman from the doorway 30 feet away. Hear it gaining 2 seconds per day on the left side of the swing. It means Nora said that you can hear something most people cannot hear. It means that if you wanted to learn this, you could learn it. She paused. It means you have the ear. The child looked at the clock for a moment. Then she looked at the master regulator on the wall, the pendulum swinging in its glass case, the hands moving at the pace that hands are supposed to move, which is the pace of time itself, unhurried and absolutely certain. Ms. Ellison said quietly from behind them that they should probably be getting along. The child handed the clock back to Nora carefully with both hands, the careful way a child handles something once they have been shown it is worth handling carefully. They left. Nora heard the door close and their footsteps on the sidewalk, in a car door, in an engine, and then the street settling back into itself, and the shop was left with its 3 voices, the master regulator and the Hamilton, and the handmade clock on the shelf. She stood in the center of the room with the bracket clock in her hands and listened. Then she set the clock on the bench. She went to the stool and sat down. She set her hands flat on the bench mat and looked at the row of clocks waiting for attention. The work that was always there. The work that was always a family's history passing through her hands on its way to the next generation. She looked at Ruth's photograph. Ruth at the bench in 1974, the loop in her eye, the pocket watch on the mat, the lamplight on her face, the concentration that was not severity but care, the full attention of a person doing work they know how to do for reasons that go beyond the mechanical function of the work itself. Nora touched the loop at her collarbone. She lifted it and held it between her fingers for a moment, the brass warm from her skin, the lens catching the late afternoon light from the rear window. Outside, the September light was amber and low, the kind of light that falls at an angle in the autumn in the Pioneer Valley and makes everything it touches look like something in the act of being remembered. It came through the rear window and fell across the plank floor in a long, warm rectangle that reached the base of the master clock case. The pendulum swung through the light back and forth, the brass, catching the amber and releasing it in a slow, steady pulse. Nora closed her eyes. She listened. The escapement was even. Both sides of the swing equal the tick in the talk, perfect mirror images of each other, steady and precise, and entirely certain the sound of a mechanism that had been correctly made and correctly maintained and was doing exactly what it had been built to do, neither rushing nor drifting, holding the present moment against the natural tendency of all things to come apart. The gear train was running cleanly. The mainspring was well wound. The clock was healthy. She knew how to hear health. Ruth had taught her to hear it not as the absence of wrong notes, but as the presence of a particular rightness, a quality of tone and precision that came through the wooden case and entered the air of the room and settled there. She sat on the wooden stool at the workbench in the amber light of the afternoon, with her grandmother's loop warm in her hand and the 2 letters from Edmund Harlow on the bench beside her, and the sound of 3 clocks filling the room in their different registers and their different rhythms. And she understood something about the life she was living that she had not had the words for until this moment. She had fallen asleep 12 years ago on a folding cot in a hallway alcove in a house that had never sounded the way a house was supposed to sound. She had woken every Saturday morning for 12 years and walked 2 miles to a kitchen on Elm Street because that kitchen sounded the way a room was supposed to sound. She had learned at 6 years old that there was such a thing as a room that sounded right, and she had learned it by pressing her ear against the case of a clock and hearing, beneath the ticking, the small rhythmic whisper that was the heartbeat of the mechanism, the escapement doing its work in the dark interior of the case, where no one could see it, keeping time with the precision of something that had no opinion about whether anyone was listening. She had spent her whole life trying to find the room that sounded exactly like that. Not approximately like it, not close enough to it, exactly like it. This was the room. Ruth had found it for her. Ruth had stood in this doorway in 1966 and had heard what needed to be heard and had gone home and had spent the next 2 decades of Saturday mornings preparing the person who would come here and hear it again. Had gone home and continued her work and met a 6-year-old and heard in that 6-year-old the things she had been asked to listen for, and had spent 12 years making sure the hands could do what the ear directed, and had then, at the end of her life, written the address on a small piece of paper in her arthritic hand and tucked it into the lining of a canvas bag and trusted it to be found at the right moment, trusting the right moment to know when to announce itself. And Harlow had built the room and prepared the spring and sealed the letters and marked the coin and trusted a 17-year-old with an envelope and the instruction that Aldridge's people would come. He had built the inheritance with the same care he had used to build the handmade clock in the drawer, every component from raw material by hand for whoever would eventually find it. The chain of instruction does not end. It continues. She had understood this abstractly when she read it. She understood it now in the way you understand things that have become part of your body through the phone call to Dolores Weston and the drive to Northampton with the box of broken glass, through the child who had pressed her ear to the mantel clock case and said it sounds like something breathing, Through the 144 Saturday mornings, and the specific warmth of Ruth's kitchen, and the specific smell of solvent and machine oil, and the particular dry heat of an old radiator that had been running since 1961. The chain had held, she had wound the spring, she had started the clock, she had kept it running, and she had kept the promise, and now the promise had passed through her hands to a child in a slightly too large blue coat who had pressed her ear to a clock case and heard the escapement from the inside on the first try. Nora Calloway sat in the amber light with her eyes closed and the loop warm in her hand and listened to the sound of the room that had been waiting for her for 55 years. And the master clock ticked steady and even and unhurried. And the shop had been speaking since the day she wound the spring, and it would go on speaking for as long as someone kept winding it, which she intended to do every morning at 7:15 for the rest of her working life. The way Ruth had wound the Hamilton. The way Mr. Aldridge had tended the clocks in his shop on Federal Street in Greenfield. The way Edmund Harlow had set the beat in the master regulator to the specific arc he preferred slightly longer than standard, because he had had the ear and had known the difference and had built a room around that knowledge and trusted it to outlast him. The pendulum swung. The hands moved. The 8 notes played on the hour from the shelf beside Ruth's photograph. And outside on Mill Street in Millbrook, the late September light was doing what autumn light does in the Pioneer Valley, making everything it touched look like something in the act of being remembered, which was Nora understood the most accurate description of what a clock does in a room where it has always been kept. It makes the present moment feel like something worth remembering, which is what she was doing now, sitting on the wooden stool at the workbench in the amber light, with her grandmother's loop in her hand, remembering the present moment, which was the moment the chain had held, which was the moment the inheritance had arrived, where it was always going, which was the moment the silence in a clockmaker's shop on Mill Street in Millbrook, Massachusetts, had become finally and completely and beyond any doubt the sound of something speaking.